Hello everyone! Thanks for coming back for this final group of spooky movie mini-reviews for October 2025. Let's see how many films I managed to cram in at the end. Movie number 1 is 2024's Ikan, also known as Monster Island. Set in World War II, a prisoner transport ship is torpedoed, and a Japanese soldier and a British POW who have been chained together wash up on an island. As they begin to evaluate their surroundings and each other, they discover the island is already occupied by a vicious sea monster. It's a war movie turned survival movie turned monster movie. I like all three of those things. Essentially, it's 1968's Hell in the Pacific, with Lee Marvin and Toshiro Mifune, mashed up with 1954's Creature from the Black Lagoon. It stars Dean Fujioka and Callum Woodhouse, and was written and directed by Singaporean Mike Wiluan. I wasn't sure how this would be. I had heard one positive review, but it also has a low IMDb rating, so I was ready for anything. Turns out it's a pretty solid monster movie, akin to Godzilla Minus One in a sense, with a compelling storyline where real-world conflict is superseded by a confrontation with the fantastical. It is a semi-foreign film, but if you're a person who's put off by the idea of reading a horror movie, you needn't worry because the dialogue is minimal, and a good deal of it is in English. I should mention, we watched it on Prime, and I had to manually turn the subtitles on to get a translation of the Japanese dialogue. But it only translates the Japanese dialogue. It doesn't have the English dialogue there as well. It's not closed captioning, you don't see music cues and monster screams. The monster is very similar to the Gill Man, except with sharper claws, sharper teeth, a more powerful body. It's like the Creature from the Black Lagoon, but with the violence and gore that a 21st century R-rated movie will allow. There was one shocking scene that had me turning to my parents and saying, "Oh, I didn't know it was gonna be that kind of movie." Orang Ikan, which is Malay for human fish, is a term for a mermaid-like cryptid of Indonesian folklore. I found an interesting article that's a nice tie-in, recounting a Japanese officer's sighting of Orang Ikan on an island in 1943. I put a link in the description if you want to check that out. I really like the monster's design, and I appreciate how careful they were not to show too much too soon. It's a gradual reveal, the monster looks good, and it's well played. The only downside is that they decided to make the throat a light flesh tone, so when the creature tilts its head back, it looks like suit actor Alan Maxon's whole neck is exposed. The first time this happened, I thought it was an embarrassing mistake. And the second time I caught it, I was like, oh my goodness, how did they let that get through? And then eventually I realized, no, that's part of the suit. The movie's on the short side, just 82 minutes, and it could have been even shorter if they had shaved off a few redundant moments near the end. There are also some action shots that echo anime style, which I thought an odd choice. But I quite liked this, and while it may be derivative of the aforementioned films, with additional notes of Predator and Grendel, that wasn't a detriment to my enjoyment of this straightforward, scary movie. Movie number 2 is actually a short from 1953, The Telltale Heart, an animated adaptation of one of Edgar Allan Poe's best, most eerie tales, narrated by James Mason. A little bird told me I should watch this before spooky season ended, and at under 8 minutes long, it was easy to make time for it. And you should too, because it is creepy! I don't know what's more impressive, the striking, unsettling art, or Mason's perfect performance, which is much better than my dramatic reading of the story. The audio and the visual go hand in hand, a perfect marriage of the macabre without actually showing or saying anything grotesque. It's so good, it makes you wish they had collaborated on a whole series of Poe shorts. Movie number 3 is 2011's The Thing. This prequel to John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982, which I reviewed 2 weeks ago, offers an explanation of the events that befell the Norwegian camp after they discovered an alien craft and its frozen passenger. It fills in the gap before the men of Outpost 31 get involved, and builds a story around the clues we see in the 82 film. I already knew that this movie had a mixed reception, but after I reviewed first the 1951 thing, and then the 1982 thing, and people kept mentioning it, and I heard so many conflicting reports of it, I just had to see it and decide for myself. My verdict is, it's okay, but it's got problems. The 1982 movie stands on its own, and it drops enough ominous hints for us to gather that what happened to the Norwegians is probably about the same as what happens to the Americans. There's room for further explanation, but it's not necessary. And this movie doesn't really add enough to justify its existence. Moreover, even though Universal insisted they were making a prequel, not a remake, this is basically a remake. Naturally, you expect certain moments and visuals to mirror the 82 film, and I applaud their efforts in replicating the original sets and props. That was good. But so much of the stuff in the middle is the same or similar, including dialogue and character dynamics. All of this forces you to compare the two movies, and this one comes up short. It does introduce some fresh ideas, like identifying people by their fillings. That's an interesting addition. Unlike 82's all-male cast, this has 2 females, like the 1951 film. One, the lead, played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead. That's fine, though it was kind of predictable that she would be the first to figure everything out and the last one standing, sort of. The movie co-stars Joel Edgerton as an American pilot, Ulrich Thompson as the lead scientist, who in a couple spots reminded me of Dr. Carrington in 1951, plus Jørgen Langhel, who plays Lars, the best of the Norwegians, in my opinion. But there's something lackluster about the movie. Most of the characters don't get a chance to distinguish themselves, so they're not that interesting. It didn't have me on the edge of my seat. It didn't really bring up the concept of self-doubt, and that's a big angle to the paranoia that I think they missed out on. It didn't tickle my brain afterward, and it didn't look very good. Now, in the last month, I haven't completely desensitized myself. The effects are disgusting and horrific, with lots of splitting and snapping and bending, tentacles, orifices, limbs, and organs where they shouldn't be. It's gross. But whereas 82's creatures were tangible and authentic, these are obviously fake. And it's distracting. Sadly, this was the result of studio interference. Initially, all the Thing effects were practical, with a minimum of CGI used for enhancement. They came up with these fantastical designs and then painstakingly brought them to fruition, and shot the scenes with them, shot the whole movie. But after a test screening, Universal cut some of the character development scenes and insisted on replacing most or all of the practical effects deemed too 80s with digital ones. The results are passable, but there's something flat and mushy about them. They just look off. The practical effects people from Amalgamated Dynamics Inc. were devastated to learn that all their hard work had just been covered up. Later, they shared their designs on YouTube and received such a positive response that they were inspired to make their own crowd-funded, practical effects-only Arctic horror movie, and that became Harbinger Down. For better or worse, what this movie had to do was all laid out, a checklist of images and events they had to recreate and explain, and they did a decent job connecting the dots. Yet somehow, there were a couple misses. One of my expectations was that they would explain the man at the radio who killed himself. But they don't, not really. At the end, we see his frozen body waiting to be discovered, but it's like they forgot to include his suicide scene. It turns out they did film it, but it was cut. They also made surprisingly quick work of the discovery of the ship. Another element I was sure they would expand on. I expected that to take up the first, 20 minutes, 25 minutes of the movie, but they just kind of gloss over it. But we do get a sequence inside the spaceship. That had some of the worst effects in the whole movie. The one thing, that just looked terrible, and that was supposed to be like the climactic one. And then the cubes, that was awful. It just looked stupid, and it was dated. It was dated for 2011. It looked more like, 2001 effects. Just bad. And also, what was that supposed to be? I also had trouble understanding where our heroine and those two snowcats fit into the picture. I don't remember those showing up in the 82 film. And as for her, what was that ending? It turns out her fate is vague because they thought they might get a sequel. When the movie bombed, that was nixed. Whether I look at this as a prequel, a remake, or its own thing, I don't find it a satisfying film. It's not terrible, it does check a lot of boxes, and lines up with the 82 thing well enough, and I'm glad I watched it because now I won't have to wonder about it. But unlike the 51 and 82 things, I doubt I'll ever be inclined to revisit it. Movie number 4 is 1983's House of the Long Shadows. A successful but cynical young author goes to stay at an abandoned manor in Wales to win a bet that he can write a horror novel in 24 hours. Upon his arrival, however, he finds he's far from alone. The draw here is not what the movie's about, but who's in it, and that's Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and John Carradine. I've always been curious about this movie whenever I would come across one of these delightful promotional photos of the 4 actors together. It's quite the assembly of horror icons, and all these men really have to do is to show up and speak lines to make their fans happy. But of course, being professionals, they do more than that. The cast also includes Richard Todd and Sheila Keith, who I guess earned the nickname the female Boris Karloff. Alongside these horror veterans, Desi Arnaz Jr. doesn't give quite such a polished lead performance. His line readings aren't always convincing, whereas it was practically Price, Lee, and Cushing's bread and butter to sell even the most preposterous dialogue. He's okay, though, and if he and leading lady Julie Peasgood are the weaker assets in the film, it's forgivable, especially when you get the full context. The movie lays the atmosphere on thick with lengthy shots of spooky rooms and cobwebbed corridors, while an obligatory thunderstorm rages overhead. Later, there are some good shocks as the narrative takes a turn. Yet it never loses the slight campy tone that's introduced with Vincent Price's entrance. All the featured spooky actors are allowed to be hammy if they want, and while the movie isn't an outright comedy, it can be fun. Peter Cushing adopts a speech impediment, and Price drops some juicy lines like, "Please don't interrupt me while I'm soliloquizing." This was directed by Pete Walker. Looking at his filmography, his main claim to fame is a string of 60s-70s sexploitation films and slashers he made before slashers became trendy. It's safe to say that this, his last film, was tamer than his typical work, and it's entertaining. I liked it, but mostly for the legends who were in it. Movie number 5 is 2015's Harbinger Down, the movie I mentioned a few minutes ago that Amalgamated Dynamics Inc. made after their disappointment over the Thing prequel. In the Bering Sea, a crab trawler carrying a team of climate researchers picks up a Soviet space capsule locked in ice. When it thaws, examination of the cosmonaut inside unleashes a monstrous virus that hideously transforms its victims. It's the Thing on a boat. I already had this on my spooky movies list. I don't think I knew of its connection to the Thing when I added it. or maybe I did and I forgot. I had actually decided against watching it this month. I was running out of time, and I felt like, well, I already did two. First I did The Thing, and then I did The Thing, and I just felt like that's enough of that kind of thing. But when I learned its backstory, when I realized the connection, I said, nah, I better do it. This isn't a great movie, but considering it was written and directed by ADI co-founder Alec Gillis, whose field is practical effects, not actors, I think it turned out okay. The first 10 to 15 minutes are the roughest, as the characters are introduced. Between the dialogue and the acting, it's a challenging first impression, but I think as things heat up, it gets better. It helps that dependable monster movie veteran Lance Henriksen is at the literal and figurative helm as the no-nonsense captain whose granddaughter is the research assistant that finds the capsule. Henriksen brings stability and experience, and everyone else pretty much falls in line. Incidentally, his granddaughter, the movie's heroine, is played by Camille Balsamo, who was also a producer and is Alec Gillis's daughter. Certain actors that I found questionable at first have good scenes later on, and unlike in the Thing prequel, each person is distinct. In less time, this movie managed to give everyone a little more development and allow various characters to interact with each other. The script does have a cheekiness, expressed chiefly in some goofy fourth wall-breaking lines, but either I'm being lenient, or it kind of gets away with it, just like Matt Winston gets away with his over-the-top performance as head of the research team. I did a 180 on him. At first I thought he was awful, and then the more he dug into the part of this pompous nitwit, the more I enjoyed him. Matt Winston, by the way, is the son of the late Stan Winston, for whom Gillis and ADI's other founder, Tom Woodruff Jr., worked in their early days. There may be more connections like that among the cast and crew, which tells me how personal this project was, and it really was something that brought together a group of people who had love and passion for practical effects and the older way of doing things. Like I said, it was crowdfunded, but Gillis and Woodruff had to put a lot of their own money into it, while other VFX colleagues, including alumni from The Thing and Alien movies, contributed their expertise. As for the creature, it is very Thing-like, as expected, so much that I wonder how they got away with it. The creature effects, unfortunately, do not reach the level of the ones in John Carpenter's movie. Those are still far superior, but this does have a similar tangibility, and I think that some of the flaws have as much to do with lighting as anything else. And there's a lot of flashing. There's one scene that is just almost unwatchable. There's so much flashing and shaky cam. That's too bad. But it is yet another creatively nasty movie that verges uncomfortably into body horror territory, with tentacles and orifices and body parts where they shouldn't be, and things bending and snapping, and, well, that's Legally Blonde reference by accident. But you know what I mean. At times it reminded me of other monster movies as well, namely Little Shop of Horrors, Godzilla vs. Biollante, and Tremors, another movie ADI worked on. I did have a little trouble following the whys and wherefores of this particular virus, I think because I've still got the other movies fresh on my brain, and I'm getting confused. I need a break. I wasn't blown away by this, so I can't claim that ADI really stuck it to Universal. But all things considered, the movie was a decent effort, and I'd even say it's on par with the Thing prequel in some respects. There are areas where one falters and the other succeeds. I had a good time with it, and my mom really liked it. Riveting is the word she used, and she liked that it was so confined. Movie number 6 is 1933's Murders in the Zoo. This Paramount release stars Lionel Atwill as a big game collector whose jealous nature leads him to use his animals to get revenge on anyone who interferes with his wife. I've been wanting to see this for at least the last 10 years, and was delighted to find it on Tubi. And then I was dismayed when it opened not with the main titles that should have been there, but with an overlay that claimed the movie starred Marlene Dietrich. What? Fortunately, it was the right movie, and from there it was smooth sailing. I don't know what that was all about. Directed by A. Edward Sutherland, this is a dark, twisted film, and a quiet one, with tense scenes often conducted in silence, like in Universal's Dracula or Frankenstein. This must be one of Atwill's most demented characters. He's part animal himself, with the coldness and cunning of a predator. The film also features young Randolph Scott, Gail Patrick, and, as comic relief, Charlie Ruggles. His character gets a job at the zoo doing press for the animals, but he can't stand to be near them without quaking and shaking himself. This shtick oscillated between being amusing and annoying, but I was tickled to learn that Bringing Up Baby was only the second movie where he gets scared by a big cat. And playing Atwill's wife is Kathleen Burke, who gave a striking performance as the Panther Woman in Island of Lost Souls the previous year. That's also a dark, twisted movie, though not as horrifying as the original novel by H.G. Wells. That is one of the scariest books I've ever read. It gave me nightmares. Much is left to the imagination, like when someone's tossed off a bridge into a crowded alligator enclosure. Otherwise, aside from a startling shot of a man with his mouth sewn shut, there isn't much violence or gore to speak of here. Yet, of all the alarming, spine-tingling movies I've seen this month, this was the most difficult for me to get through. The reason for that is the snakes, which figure into this story in a big way. I did fine with the monsters, the aliens, the vampires, ghosts, werewolves, even the spiders in Arachnophobia, but snakes are another story. I have my reasons, which I am not inclined to share. Suffice it to say, this movie was only 66 minutes long, but I couldn't wait for it to be over. So I'm not sure how much I really enjoyed this movie that I'd been looking forward to for so long, but it was a good, tense, disturbing little picture, and I can say without a doubt, I found it scary. That's it for Spooky Season 2025, and I hope you had a good time watching this review series. There are plenty of films on my list that I didn't get to, including titles I kept adding along the way, and that means I already have lots of choices for next year. I hope you enjoyed this video. You can find the films and where I watched them listed in the description, and I'll be back next Saturday as we resume our regular, more varied programming. Thanks for watching.